Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, September 27th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the Wisconsin Supreme Court and their congressional maps ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ordered legal briefs recently. Yesterday, the announcement was made in two of their congressional map challenge cases. Arguments here being made by the Democrats that the gerrymandered map that is in place in the state of Wisconsin must come down and is unconstitutional as declared in their legal brief here, that it is not allowed in the state of Wisconsin going into the upcoming midterm and presidential cycle, ultimately asking the Supreme Court to mandate a brand new map. Now, this actually was raised by Democrats before in Wisconsin in 2021. They went to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The Republicans argued that their map was not a gerrymander and that they had the legal basis and legal ability to go ahead and move forward with their version of the congressional map. And so what the Wisconsin Supreme Court ultimately ended up deciding back then was that the map could be slightly changed by the governor, but not at all to the degree that would be necessary in building out an electoral college, a congressional map that is more fair for Democrats in the state. And for a bit of context, Democrats have not held the majority of representatives from the state of Wisconsin at all in the past 15 years from this state. The last time you'll find the Democrats had the advantage in the Supreme Court, in the congressional races in Wisconsin was in 2008 when Obama won the state by double digits. 2 years later, in 2010, Republicans would claim that majority, and with it the state legislative chamber, and ultimately draw their congressional map in a way that was so excessively in favor of the Republican Party that it made it so from 2012, even through the years and difficult ones at that for the GOP, like 2018, that by the time you reached the end of the decade, it was the Democrats who were playing defense in their singular third district, and the rest of the state had moved pretty far to the right. By the time we reached 2024, Republicans were able to expand their seats even further than what they had in 2010 to 2020. That made it so Republicans were at 6 seats in the state, and Democrats are ultimately at just 2. And so that's where the Democrats step in and say that they want Wisconsin to redraw their congressional maps, and in the past, Wisconsin Supreme Court wouldn't even hear the case. In fact, we saw that earlier on this summer, Wisconsin Supreme Court refused to hear challenges directly about the state's congressional district boundaries, shooting it down to a lower court, to which we saw Democrats make that argument to the lower courts. Now the lower courts are building it up, and now Wisconsin Supreme Court suddenly is all ears. And it makes sense. This effort to change the Wisconsin maps after constant rejection and redirection by the court largely is inspired by the way the Republicans are acting in many other parts of this country, like Texas, Florida, Indiana, Missouri, to redraw their congressional maps, and redistricting advocates are all in and have a lot of energy to push forth these cases in states like Wisconsin. After all, these things don't just happen randomly. There has to be groups that are willing to fight the fight, especially in states like Wisconsin, where historical precedent actually has not worked in their direction as much as they would have hoped. And taking a look at the way that these, the reforms are being argued by the Democrats in the state, the fact is, if Wisconsin Supreme Court is ordering for legal briefs on whether or not they should continue hearing the case, it means that decision from back in July was largely what we expected it to be, which was ultimately a deferring it of responsibility to another chamber, allowing them to eventually uphold the ruling of that lower chamber in favor of the Democratic Party. Because Wisconsin Supreme Court is far from a conservative majority court. Democrats have maintained this dominance here for the past 5 years, and they've only been able to do so because they have been able to win in these off-cycle elections. The most recent one, we saw Brad Schimmel ended up losing in that race. But the point is that, when you see who the Democrats run, Susan Crawford, Janet Protasewicz, they run candidates that are ideologically aligned with the Democratic Party, but again, come into this with a more legal experience, more of a higher bounds of reputation. I mean, you have found that it is a combination of factors that have led to Democrats holding the majority in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and it might very well pay off in this state. And I think a lot of it really is inspired by what the Republicans are doing elsewhere, not even so far as just talking about those who are putting forth the case, but also Supreme Court justices consume the news in the same way we do. That's why you oftentimes find that if Donald Trump is publicly calling on a state Supreme Court to rule one way, and they are partisan MAGA judges, oftentimes they will agree with the ruling of the president, even if this is something that you might not even be able to find any type of constitutional authority around. Because in states like Wisconsin and across the country, unless it is elevated to the U.S. Supreme Court, and on cases of partisan gerrymandering, the U.S. Supreme Court has been very adamant in every case, red and blue, they do not take up partisan gerrymandering cases. This is the end for both parties in the state of Wisconsin. Democrats have suffered some pretty tremendous losses, but here's also the catch, too, for Democrats in the state. Although they have maintained the majority, but then shot it down in 2021, one of the key proponents of maintaining those Wisconsin maps that ultimately ended up benefiting the Republican Party was a Democrat who was in that position, who now, taking a look at this, we are seeing evolving views. We are seeing that there have been now new justices elected in the position. And thinking about just exactly what this might mean for 2026, if Wisconsin Supreme Court gets to the position where they say, okay, our ruling is that Wisconsin needs to redraw their map, that's what's going to happen. Even in 2021, when the Supreme Court wouldn't necessarily throw out the map entirely, they did order redraws. And Wisconsin Supreme Court has also ordered redraws before, even much so that the United States Supreme Court upheld the new Wisconsin maps that the Supreme Court had intervened on that gave Democrats a fighting chance at the state legislature. I mean, these things have happened in the state, and it's not beyond the depth of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. But it looked as if for a while they were looking for an alternative pathway for this to reach their court case, an alternative system, so that way they can now, hide behind, or whatever it might be, alter the way the perception on this case is as it is ruled by the state Supreme Court. And so I will be very interested to see, like Utah, a state where we weren't really expecting at this point in time. I mean, it was a Utah Republican Supreme Court appointed by Republican governors for years on end, who decided that the congressional map in Utah was too gerrymandered. Now, it's not as gerrymandered. Wisconsin's not as bad as Utah, a state where, Kamala Harris got a higher percentage of the vote than she does across the state compared to any singular congressional district. The Republicans won more statewide than they, less statewide rather than they did in any district in particular, which really goes to show that the map here was drawn in such a strong and instrumental way to benefit the GOP. But the Utah Republican court said, this is wrong. You need to redraw the map here because you are violating the rights of the constituents. You are defying the Utah Constitution when voters in 2018 in Utah decided by a citizens-led referendum on the ballot that gerrymandering was to be illegal and codified in the Constitution. The Republicans in the state legislature overturned it while nobody was paying attention in the height of the pandemic. 2 years later, they redraw the map. They make it 4-0. They do it again for 2024, but this time, again, largely motivated by what we are seeing across the country, Democrats made an extremely compelling case. A lower court judge made the ruling that Utah must redraw the map. Utah Republicans then said, we are going to go to the state Supreme Court because that's our playing ground. And they lost. And they lost in a way that now we are seeing the new maps here that could potentially open up the opportunity for Democrats to gain 2 additional seats in Utah. One of the biggest things that could really blow up in their face, because had they just drawn a map similar to what they had from 2012 to 2020, a map like this with a competitive but Republican-leaning district, I can near guarantee you the map would have never even been touched. But because they got greedy and wanted to not fight a contested seat, well, ultimately, now they might be fighting in 2. And like Wisconsin, the 2 number rings a bell, because if Wisconsin was to have a fairer map, thinking about how it voted in the last presidential election, Democrats should have equal amount of seats here compared to Republicans. If not, at least 1 additional seat, and certainly not a ratio of 3-1 Republicans to Democrats hailing from the state. Democrats have one opportunity in 2026, and they've been targeting it for quite some time. Derek Van Orden from Wisconsin's 3rd District is prime target number 1 for Democrats in the state. Rebecca Cook is running again in 2026, but if they are to redraw the map, I can guarantee you that's the first to go. But without Wisconsin's 3rd, Democrats don't really have that much of a fighting chance, barring a massive overperformance relative to what we're expecting for Wisconsin Democrats. The next state for them, or seat for them, would be Paul Ryan's seat, with Brian Steele, who's been in this seat since 2018, Wisconsin's 1st, which was decided by 10 points in the last cycle. The next opportunity to get to even near where Republicans are at right now would be in Wisconsin's 8th district. But taking a look at all of the other districts here, Wisconsin plus 27, GOP plus 27, plus 23, plus 29, it's incredibly difficult to even see a pathway in which Democrats could even reach that number of 6 from the Republicans, because the map was drawn in a way that makes it damn near impossible. And so that's why you're seeing this, urgency on the front of the Democrats to redraw the congressional boundaries in Wisconsin. And the signals I'm getting, honestly speaking, from the Wisconsin Supreme Court seem like they are open to the idea of redrawing the maps. Historically, they had been very opposed, but it was different leadership. Different Democrats in office. In some cases, Republicans had the advantage across the state. There were a multitude of reasons to believe in the past that there was no urgency on the side of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin to get forth through their new congressional map, because it was set in stone, it had been ruled on time and time again, and Democrats felt defeated. But now, with the surge of states like Utah and others considering redrawing maps, California, Texas, now doing it, there's an opening here. And it looks as if the Wisconsin Supreme Court, again, for the first time in a very long time, seem to be open to the idea of challenging their state's congressional boundaries. So, what will the map look like if Wisconsin redraws? I told you Democrats will probably gain 1 to 2 seats, but maybe even more. If this Supreme Court ends up siding with the Democrats heavily enough and says, you've suffered 2 terms of a consistent GOP gerrymander, we'll take a map from you, Democrats might be in a better position. No guarantee it'll happen, and no, exact answer as to what we can expect from the Wisconsin Supreme Court. But what I've gotten thus far is a hint and an indication that Wisconsin Supreme Court is finally willing to listen after their recent election earlier on this year with a new justice, a new name, and somebody leading it at the helm to redraw the maps here. There's a very real possibility that it does, and taking a look at where we are on the national stage, the moment to make it happen is now. The question is, will Wisconsin Supreme Court follow through? Only time will tell. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.